Good morning, everyone. I'm Jim Zogby, and I'm with the Arab American Institute, and I'm proud that we and Rainbow Push and 11 other national organizations have come together to host this summit on Gaza. I think all of us have been stunned by what we've seen unfolding since October 7th. There was no doubt that what happened on that day was horrific and caused a tremendous trauma in the Jewish community worldwide. And people reacted in varying ways, but there was a sense of vulnerability that it exposed and a sense of pain. What's happened since has caused the same vulnerability and the same pain among Palestinians, and while one evoked the pogroms, the other evoked the Nakba. The point is, for us to be real, we have to understand the pain on all sides. We also have to understand that nothing will be done until there's a ceasefire. So we've come together to call for a ceasefire. And of course there has to be accountability. People have said, shouldn't there be accountability? Of course there has to be accountability, but there has to be an end to the killing before there can be accountability. And once that happens, then we have to make hard choices. And one of which is, can we have the wealth of our nation used in the way that it's being used now? Do we need to be sending bombs that kill people when what we need is humanitarian aid and housing to give them safety and security? So we've come together around three very essential demands: a ceasefire, aid for reconstruction and humanitarian assistance, and conditioning or cutting U.S. military assistance so that we send a clear message that a new dynamic has to unfold in the Middle East. What that dynamic is and the solutions that we propose, we have lots of debate about that. But we can't have that debate while the bombs are dropping, while the raids are occurring, while kids are dying. And so we're together around those three essential demands. And I'm so proud that I'm here today with Reverend Fredrick Douglass Haynes, who's the new head of Operation Rainbow Push, founded by Jesse Jackson. And we're here on Martin Luther King weekend.
That's it.
And it is remarkably appropriate that we're doing it now, because the message of nonviolence, the message of peace, and the message of putting your life on the line for peace is what this is all about. And so I'm proud, Reverend Haynes, to be with you, and I'm proud of the folks who weathered the storm to be with us, and all of you out there watching us. Despite our delay, thank you for your patience. Reverend Haynes?
Yes, thank you. Jim Zogby, of course, is a hero, a justice warrior, a general in the fight for freedom, and his opening remarks remind us of how valuable he is to humanity. And so I want to thank him for his leadership. I want to thank him for his longtime partnership with that icon for justice, the Reverend Jesse Louis Jackson Sr. We are here at Rainbow Push, quite appropriate. After all, Reverend Jesse Jackson, for well over 40 years, has been a global prophetic icon, understanding the need for a global consciousness, picking up, as it were, where the drum major for justice and peace, Martin Luther King Jr., left off, as in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? He has a chapter on the world house and our responsibility to determine how are we going to live together as a human family in this increasingly shrinking world house. Reverend Jackson picked up that baton, and with this global consciousness has been able to stride like a colossus across the world. And always at points where there was conflict and problems, Reverend Jackson came with the solution. So I think it's appropriate that we have this conversation, this convening here at the headquarters of Rainbow Push, given the fact that looking at this historic pain there in what is called the Middle East, Reverend Jackson, a long time ago, called for security for Israel and justice for Palestinians. Of course, that was remixed in the streets of protest with the same sentiment: no justice, no peace. And we can apply that to what's happening right now. If there is no justice for Palestinians, we cannot expect to have peace and security in Israel. Justice and peace go together. And so we have come here this day and tomorrow to call for the uniting in a holy wedlock of justice and peace. Justice for Palestinians, and yes, security for Israel. And so that's why we are here at the headquarters of Rainbow Push, because of all that Reverend Jesse Jackson has done and taught us about the understanding of the partnership between justice and peace, especially applying it to what's happening in what is called the Middle East. But also, as Jim said, I think it's very important that we are having this conversation on the eve of a country that will celebrate the legacy and liberating love of the drum major for peace and justice, Martin Luther King Jr. And yet, if we're not careful, our celebration will ring hollow, if not hypocritical, if we sit on the sidelines and do not stand against the atrocity that is taking place in what is called the Middle East. And so let us not celebrate Dr. King and then go back to business as usual and ignore the pain and the plight of what has been taking place in that section of our world for decades now. So yes, we hurt with those who suffered the horror of October 7th. That was evil, it was wrong, it's painful, it's heartbreaking. But the disproportionate response to what took place October 7th, in a real sense, is inconsistent with justice, and it does not set the stage for true and lasting peace. And so, since this is the eve of the celebration of Martin Luther King Jr., I hope you'll let me remix him. Martin King said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Here's the Freddie Haynes remix. A massacre and violence anywhere is a threat to peace and freedom everywhere. And that is why we have come on this Friday and this Saturday to discuss the fact that we are calling for security and for peace. And when we do that, I'll remix Dr. King one more time. We can say, now is the time for a ceasefire. Now is the time to strategize for a lasting peace. Now is the time to open the door for the safe passage of humanitarian aid. Now is the time to envision what peace and justice will look like in that section of the world. And now is the time where we begin to strategize, to plan for the healing and rebuilding of Gaza. If this world could come together after World War II with the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, we need to come together with the plan to rebuild in a just fashion the homeland of those in Gaza. And so where there is security, it will be because there is justice. And so, Reverend Jackson, thank you for your vision. Dr. King, we're going to honor you right and not just have empty platitudes where we say, I have a dream, but we're also going to stand for justice and fight for peace. And when we do that, we truly honor the legacy of Martin Luther King.
You know, Reverend Haynes, when I worked with Reverend Jackson back in the late 70s, early 80s, and he used that expression, justice for Palestinian, security for Israel, two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other.
Right.
We were outliers in the national discourse. We went to the Democratic Convention. I got to speak on a platform. Even our Jackson delegates weren't all with it. But we did a poll for this summit to find out where the American people are. And frankly, that message is right now where the American people are. It's not where politics is, but it's where the people are.
Right.
And so let me put up the poll numbers so you all can see what I'm talking about here, because we got some results, I think, that were really quite heartening. Let's look at the first poll number. Number one. There it is. If you notice, green is, are your sympathies with Palestinians, blue with Israelis, red with both, and black with neither. Notice that both dominates in every sector, except among Republicans. But among young people, 18 to 29, Palestinians 2-1. And among non-white, the numbers of Israeli-Palestinian, again, it is more Palestinian support than Israeli support, but 37 for both. Let's look now at the next on this issue of balance continuing. As a result of this current conflict, do you have sympathies with the Israelis, the Palestinians, or with both? If you look, you'll see that both trumps in every instance, or triumphs, better word, in every instance, except among young people, again, and among non-white voters, where Palestinian sympathies have gained significantly. In the next survey poll, we ask, in terms of handling the situation, how do you describe current policy toward the Middle East? 50% across the board say it supports Israel, and very few say supports Palestinians. But if you ask the next question, how do you think the Biden administration should pursue policy? Let's go to the next one. Next slide. There it is. Again, both. They want policy to strike a balance between the two, which is where the majority of the American people are, except again for Republicans who want to favor Israel. That's the outlier there. The next one is, which statement comes closer to your view on the next poll question? The U.S. should always side with Israel, or the U.S. should act as a fair and impartial broker? Let's go to that one. There it is. Across the board, the U.S. should be a fair and honest broker. 68% of Democrats, 66% of young voters, 63% of non-white voters. And let's understand, this presents trouble for the White House and trouble for Democrats, because young voters and people of color are the core constituents of the Democratic Party. And they're not on board anymore. You lose them and you lose. Let's go to the next one. Which statement comes closer to your view? Next slide. There we are. U.S. should always provide unrestricted financial aid, financial military assistance to Israel. The U.S. should not provide unrestricted financial military aid to Israel if it continues to operate in a way which puts civilian lives at risk in Gaza. Look at those numbers. Even among Republicans, a majority are saying, do not provide it. Oh, no, wait. We skipped one. You want to go back? There it is. It's a plurality of Republicans. And again, 59% of young voters and 55% of non-white voters. Now that one, the number 7. Last month, the Biden administration approved $147.5 million in weapons sales to Israel without congressional approval. Some Democratic senators objected. Who do you agree with most, President Biden or the Democratic senators who objected? Next slide up here, the one about objecting. There it is. The Democratic senators win. They even win with Republicans. They clearly win with young voters. American people aren't with this proposition. And we go to the last one, the last set here. Wait, no, there's one more on the aid issue. Let's go to that one. This is about the annual $3.8 billion in foreign military assistance to Israel. Again, every constituent group, with the exception of Republicans, support conditioning or cutting military aid. Now we have two final questions where we thought we'd ask voters. Let's go that one. Switch, there we go. Members of Congress have debated supporting or opposing a ceasefire in Gaza. Are you more or less inclined to support a member of Congress who supports the ceasefire? Majorities across the board, Republicans and Democrats, want more inclined to support. We asked it in the reverse way. The next one, this is it. Would you be more or less inclined to support a candidate who opposes a ceasefire? Half less inclined. And so what the takeaways from the poll are that there's a growing balance in American public opinion on this issue. Whatever sympathies Israel might have gained after October 7th, they squandered by their behaviors and continuing behaviors. There was already a shift, and the shift has now solidified into the numbers you have here. Number one. Number two, there is an increasing call for reducing or conditioning aid based on behavior. And finally, people want a ceasefire. And they're less inclined to support a candidate who opposes it, and they're more inclined to support a candidate who is for it. And it all I think we're at a tipping point, sir. I think it's fascinating to me. I remember Wes Michelson's with us today. He worked for Mark Hatfield, one of the early opponents of the war in Vietnam. And I remember back in '68, Pete McCloskey, who is known, people remember Pete McCloskey because he was one of the early supporters of Palestinian rights in the Congress as a Republican. But I remember Pete McCloskey because in 1968, in the height of Vietnam, he won a congressional race running against Shirley Temple. And everybody thought, oh my God, you can't beat Shirley Temple. She's an icon. Everybody loved the little darling from America. She was a Reagan-like Republican. She ran for the war. Pete McCloskey, Marine colonel, ran against the war. And he beat her. He beat her badly. And it was funny because it was like, I don't know if you all read the book, Siddhartha, Hermann Hesse's book, but there's a scene where Siddhartha's out in the woods and he sees an old sick man and he says, could that happen to me? Because his parents had sheltered him. And Pete McCloskey got to Washington and people said, oh, can this happen to me? Could I lose on this? And there was a shift. And we're seeing that beginning here. We're seeing people win because they're pro-Palestinian or pro-peace. We're seeing people lose because they take the opposite position. This is a tipping point, and the point of us involved in this movement is to continue this struggle for justice, this struggle for peace, this struggle for security that is mutual, that doesn't prioritize one group over another, but recognizes that unless there's justice for all, there's no peace for anybody. And that's, I think, the lesson of this situation we're in right now, this horrific situation we're in. And frankly, you know, when I keep saying to people, you don't build peace on the backs of 23,000 people dead. No, no way. The people don't say, oh, I think we'll give up now and we'll just all be nice and love Israel. No, you make more hatred with killing.
Thank you.
And I think what the American people are saying is that enough, and they want leadership that recognizes that we've seen enough. No more money for it, no more support for it. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Jim, it's very interesting. One of the statements you made earlier was that you and Reverend Jackson were outliers, 84, 88, with the prophetic, principled stances you were taking. It's very interesting that whenever you are principled and prophetic, it takes a while for the world to catch up with the truth that you've been expressing. And the results of the polling let us know that finally, it's almost as if there are those in the nation, especially a young generation and people of color, are catching up with the principled and prophetic stand that Reverend Jackson, that you and others had decades ago. And I think that's very interesting, and it's something that all of us should be aware of. As a matter of fact, it reminds me of what took place Memorial Day 2020. At the height of the pandemic, the day before Memorial Day, the dominant attitude of many about policing and the black community was on the side of the police, and that evidently blacks were doing something wrong. But Memorial Day 2020, when Derek Chauvin was caught on camera in real time putting his knee in the neck. There's the icon for justice, Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson Sr., that prophet without peer. Let's give it up for my big brother. Yeah, so glad to have our drum major for peace and justice, Reverend Jackson. We've been quoting you, man. Security for Israel, but not without justice for Palestine. Thank you. Let me get back to what I was saying, Reverend Jackson. Very seriously, so on Memorial Day, when Chauvin put his knee in the neck of George Floyd for over 9 minutes, in real time, the world saw the wickedness of an abusive policing system. And when the world saw it, the world rose up in rebellion because they saw real time the horrors and the hatred that was being expressed by Derek Chauvin. That happened in 2020. I'm suggesting that there's a generation now that just as what took place in 2020, real time, a generation that has been watching in real time the horrors and the atrocity taking place in Gaza, and don't miss this, in the name of a response to a horror that took place October 7th. And there's a generation, my daughter, and illustration, my daughter, and she's a millennial, and her cousins who are millennials, they sent me a thread, a group text thread that they were engaged in discussing what's taking place in the Middle East. I'll give you just a little bit of what was said. My daughter says, make it make sense. Why is it that someone is daring to say, I've got Israel's back, but they don't have the back of Palestinian children? Make it make sense. And then her cousin said, the math ain't mathin', because my tax dollars are going to funding oppression and a massacre while we claim to espouse values of democracy. And the values of democracy are being contradicted by what we are espousing in the Middle East. And that's when the response was, the math ain't mathin'. And so what the polling is revealing, there's a generation now that because they are watching in real time, inhumane, evil taking place, death, the blowing up of a hospital, are you serious? Children being maimed at best, killed at worst, are you kidding me? All of that's going on. They're watching it and receiving notifications real time, and then receiving a message, and I say this in love, where someone can go to the site of a massacre that took place in a church. Mother Emanuel AME Church. Go to that site where a massacre took place, castigate white supremacy, and not castigate white supremacy when it comes to the world platform, not castigate evil and massacres that are taking place every single day in Gaza. Make it make sense. Make it make sense. The math ain't mathin'. And so we've gathered here on the eve of the birthday of the drum major for justice and peace. And we ain't gonna have no hypocritical celebration of Martin King's birthday, because there's a young generation that is declaring, make it make sense, and the math ain't mathin'. Don't espouse democratic values and support genocide.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Haynes. I'm so glad to see you, Reverend Jackson. Thank you. And I gotta point out Mrs. Jackson there too, because Mrs. Jackson has been a part of this struggle for a long, long time. And I appreciate you both. I just want to say one thing about youth, because my brother wrote a book back in 2008 called The Way We'll Be. And he spoke about a generation, he didn't call them millennials, he called them the first globals. There is a consciousness young people have, he said, that is all-encompassing. They cry for places in the world that my generation didn't know existed. I would add one thing, though, that it's not, there always has been. My granddaughter, who I'm going to boast for a little bit about her, she's just brilliant. 8th grade, she wrote a paper about youth in the civil rights movement. And she said when the old generation began to fail and get tired, she called it the intrepid spark of youth would ignite them with sit-ins, would ignite them with action. And so young people, Old Testament says, the young people shall lead. And they are leading. I remember in gay rights, I mean, how many people I knew came and said, well, I never really was for that, but my kids, they made me think. And I know this I remember when Barack Obama ran, I went to 11 states to rallies and events, and people would come up to me and say, I'm not here, but I'm only here because my kids asked me to come, and pushed me to do this. And so it's even more so today because of social media, because they are seeing a reality that most of us only get from TV networks that is skewed, and newspapers that is double skewed, and the people we work with. But these kids are seeing it in real time, and it is impacting them and paining them dearly. And so I thank you, Eva, and your generation. I mean, what Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine and young folks are doing is providing a kind of a leadership that we so desperately have needed, so that we can follow you and the moral conscience that you bring to this in a way that challenges us, because my kids call me a wuss. Because I've learned over the years, you know, you go, well, I don't want to shake the boat, whatever. And these kids are not, they're not compromising in that way. They want justice, and they don't deal with baloney. That was a polite word because we're in a, they don't deal with that. So I thank you for your courage. I thank you for your vision. I thank you for allowing old folks like us the opportunity to reflect on what you've done and the reality you've helped make for us. And we're going to take a break for a minute or so, and then come back with some of those voices who are going to speak to us about how we got here, Muslim voices, Black voices, youth voices from the Jewish community, and others who will tell us this is where we are, and this is why we're where we are. So thank you all. We'll be back in just about a minute. Thank you.